Welcome to Baptist Bridges, a podcast by the Canadian Baptists of Ontario and Quebec. We will explore a variety of topics that we trust will be meaningful to people and churches around the world. We're glad you're here. Today, we are going to be talking about a really important topic that's dear to my heart and relevant to many of our CBOQ churches. I would argue relevant to all of them. Our topic is ministry in our small and mighty churches. Now, why I say this is relevant to so many in CBOQ is the vast majority of our CBOQ churches fall in the category that we would be called small, according to how that's defined in church literature. We'll talk about that more in a minute. But even if you're not part of one of those small churches, you have small churches in your association with you, you know pastors from small churches, and we hope this will help you understand and think about how you can also support your fellow churches and colleagues. I have three fantastic guests with us today, each of whom are here for a very particular reason in this conversation, and I'd love to introduce them. Of course, I'm Leanne. I'm the Executive Minister of CBOQ, and with us we have Ruth, Michelle, and Ron. So Ruth, would you start by introducing yourself?
Sure. So my name's Ruth, and I am the pastor of Calvary Baptist Church, specifically Calvary Baptist on Main in Toronto, because there are more than one Calvary within our CBOQ network. It's a 20-minute walk from where I live with my aunt, and I've been serving there since the pandemic, and I'm really grateful to be their part-time permanent pastor, serving a small and wonderful group of people, and we get about maybe 30 to 50 on a Sunday, depending on how many are in person. And we also have people who join us online and by phone, because there's a lot of people who can't physically make it out to church. So we count those people as well, because we have everybody joins us together. And that's Calvary in a nutshell.
Thank you, Ruth. And so it's so great to have you here along with Michelle Belzile.
Well, hello, my name is Michelle Belzile, and I'm the pastor of Elmer Baptist Church, and that's in Ontario, part of Elmer, Quebec, which is right next to Ottawa. It's a congregation in a town of about 8,500, and we've got a significant Mennonite community, some old order Mennonite, and some Amish as well that farm the area. And so that's a significant part of our community in the city, in the town.
I was so intentional that I wanted to have a pastor of a small church in a city, because sometimes we think small and rural go together, and someone a little bit more rural. But any of you who are from a really small place, you know, I grew up very rural. We would have went to a town of 8,000 to get our groceries. That would have been big to us. But we will allow 8,000 to be rural here today. But along with these folks, we also have Ron Johnston. So Ron, tell us about you and what you're up to.
Yeah, my name's Ron Johnston, and I'm executive director of an organization called Small Church Connections. And our whole goal is to serve small churches and small church pastors across the whole country, across Canada. I think when it comes to small churches, I love all churches, but I have a passion for small churches. I believe they are so important in God's plan for His church here in this country. And so I'm thrilled to be able to be here today and representing Small Church Connections.
Fantastic. And you also attend a small church in New Dundee.
I do.
And so this is very near to your heart in many ways. So Ron, of course, your expertise in this area makes you an excellent guest today, along with our fellow serving pastors. And I'd love to start with you as the executive director, this is the title, of Small Church Connections. How do we define a small church? What's the official definition? What makes a church small?
Well, the first thing I maybe would say is there's no official definition. We very arbitrarily chose the number 150 for Sunday morning attendance. Mm-hmm. But I've spoken with other people working in small churches, and they range from 100 to 300. Now, 300, I think, for most in Canada sounds ridiculous.
Sounds huge.
It sounds,
big.
yeah,
Man,
that
huge.
sounds real
love
big.
to have 300. Yeah.
But we chose 150 in Sunday morning attendance because we found that membership and that just doesn't work at all for that. But actually, I find that it's more of a mindset than it is a number. There's churches of 120 that really aren't small churches, and there's churches at the 150 mark that very much are. And so it's really defined by a way of thinking.
And how's that way of thinking? Is it the way that you're structured? I would think it's sort of maybe the assumption that everyone knows each other. It's very relational based. What is that true? What would you add to that in terms of that way of thinking?
At the heart of small church. And it's interesting. I've asked this question to a lot of small church people. What's the biggest strength of your church? And 100% of the time, this has never failed, I get the answer back: relationships. And that really is the heart of a small church. It's why people attend them. And it's what, I sometimes say, a large church has to spend a lot of money and put a lot of time through small groups and things, trying to get what small churches just naturally have.
What a beautiful statement. Isn't that lovely?
Mm-hmm.
So you said that we use the benchmark of about 150, and Ruth over here kind of went, that would be exciting, 150. And so did Michelle. And the truth is, I'm going to do what I think is a pretty accurate guess. I would say 85 to 95 of our CBOQ churches are less than 150. Wow. It's definitely in the 90 range. And so we are a gathering of small churches. And if we got smaller, a big hunk of those would be less than 50. Huge number of our churches are less than 50. And we've got lots of churches less than 25. And so if you're listening in those categories today, you are one of many, for sure. So how is ministry different in a small church, in your opinions, than in a large church? We often, if we're pastors in smaller churches, we listen maybe to the podcasts or read the books, and they're often very geared to a particular assumption of a church that maybe is bigger than our churches. So what's different? Let's start with you, Michelle.
For me, it's about relationships, but more importantly, it's about the particular culture of that particular congregation. My experience in my time pastoring is that you have to take the time to get to know that particular culture before you can speak into it. And it means changing the way you do ministry in each context, because you're seeking to find a way of breathing life into a community by becoming part of that community. I often find that the pastor is not the most important person in a small church. The pastor in churches that have struggled a lot with not being able to keep a pastor for financial reasons or whatever, they learn how to adapt by being able to plunk in a new pastor each time and still maintain a sense of community. And so it's important for the pastor not to enter into that thinking that they're going to fix everything. Yeah.
I like what you said about actually in a small church, you have to figure out each church, which we have to do with any size church we're in. But sometimes those programs or those, what's the word I'm looking for, like those structures or systems that, the book or the, insert this, won't work in a small church because each of them are so, you have to find out that unique fit for the small church. That's what I heard you saying there. I think that's insightful. Ruth or Ron, what would you add about what's different in a small church than a larger church?
Yeah, so I have family members pastoring in all sorts of different contexts within our Baptist family on the west and the east, and I'm here in the middle. But what I hear a lot is just the difference in staffing as well. Like, on people who are on teams where you've got, your next generation's pastor and you've got your teaching pastor and you've got pastor for this site and that sort of thing versus just being the pastor. People are often like, oh, are you the lead pastor or the associate pastor? I'm like, no, I'm the pastor.
The answer is yes.
Yeah. and so it's mostly driven by volunteers and their capacity and that sort of thing. And that's we'll get into this a little bit later, but I think we have to kind of decide really carefully on where your focus is going to lie as a church when you only have mostly volunteers and minimal staff to work with, because you can't be overtaxing yourself to try and be all things to all people when you don't have all of the things in front of you to be able to work with.
Wow. And what a weight that must be, right? To realize everything ultimately, as you're overseeing the church, you're thinking of every single piece, which of course mostly pastors would in one way or another, but it really can come back to you in very tangible ways, right? So in a small church, it's not far-fetched for the lead pastor to preach on a Sunday, teach Sunday school before church starts, run youth group on Friday night, run the women's ministry on Tuesday. That can be, and then, also make all the tea and coffee and cookies in between. So I think that's interesting. Would you add anything to that, Ron, about what's different?
I was thinking when you were saying that, and I think maybe one of the differences is that by the end of the week, the small church pastor is a little more tired than the larger church because they're doing so many different things. But yeah, the other thing that I would say too is that in a small church, I think everybody expects to have a voice. They expect to be heard in the decisions that are made. In a large church with multiple staff, you just expect that the staff is going to make those decisions. And I think that's an important difference.
These are so interesting. So what do you feel, I've already commented on, there's the church studies and the literature, the conferences we all go to or would like to go to. Sometimes small church pastors can't afford the conferences. But what do you think they miss? Because that literature often focuses on bigger churches. What gets missed there? How about you, Ron? Why don't we go backwards this time around the circle?
I think a huge thing that is missed between large church and small church, if you're the only staff member, I think this was so true through COVID. If you're the only staff member, then you have no one else to talk with, to pray with, to do all those things. If you're in a large church with a staff of 5 or 6, that can be huge.
It makes a big difference. And I think even to speak about the conferences, I remember being at a conference once and the speaker got up and said, "Pastors, your role is just to focus on vision. You need to get your other staff to do your visiting and your other staff to do this and that. And, you need to just focus on visioning." And it can be discouraging because I was like, I don't have that option. I got to go to the hospital, and so it missed the reality of when all those things fall in you. What would either of you add to that? What gets missed when it focuses on the larger churches?
I think in my context at Calvary, I'm hearing what you're saying, but it's a little bit different because the volunteers step up so much. And so I know, and I've heard, the struggle for a lot of other small church pastors where they're having to preach week in and week out and do all the visitation, that kind of stuff. I have 3 lay ministers within my congregation. So that's 10% of the congregation. And so I share the pulpit with them, and we try to include people within our congregation to be able to exercise that gift as well. And, I feel very much supported by the volunteers, but I know that that's also taxing on them. And it's this weird dynamic of, I'm the one who's getting paid, but they're doing so much of the work and trying to figure out that balance of, maintaining, knowing full well that I'm not a full-time pastor and maintaining my own boundaries while also giving all of myself to that job while recognizing how much the volunteers are giving. That there's that dynamic going on there.
Which speaks to another small church reality, because my assumption is you're probably part-time because of the financial reality of a small church, which puts that pressure on, right? So again, you might have the reality of a pastor that it's expected to do a lot because they're the only pastor. They don't have the support of other staff to kind of bounce ideas off chat. Or it's really volunteer-led because there's no other option, which can come with its pros and cons. Sometimes those volunteers can be great, but some of our pastors out there might know the experience of having those volunteers that have been running the church for a long time.
Yes.
And that can create really interesting dynamics.
Yeah,
what do you think of, Michelle?
Well, in our context, because we have a significant Mennonite and Amish communities that tend to be separatists in nature, the people in my congregation, my seniors were born there, and their parents were born there, and So it's difficult to have a high energy ministry program when you're asking somebody to take another 3-year term, and this will be their 12th term as a deacon. They took a year off, and so they kind of go, "I did that," and then you're drawing on them still in their 60s, and so to bring in a lot of activity to sustain when they're already significantly invested in ministry in their community. Driving for VON or working at the food bank, or it's learning to see that as part of the church's ministry too. When we send out leaders from our midst to minister to the community, that is church ministry.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And if I can just piggyback off of that too, there's also the just the reality of small churches is that we can only focus on so much. And one of the things that I've really struggled with, like my background growing up in church, most of the volunteer work that I did was in children's ministry. When I was studying at Tyndale for my undergrad, it was biblical studies and theology with a focus in youth ministry. And now that I'm at Calvary, we don't actually have the capacity for youth ministry or for children's ministry with our volunteers. And I'm like a firm believer that if we're going to do children's ministry or youth ministry, we have to have people who are passionate about that rather than kind of just making it happen so that it happens. And there is that struggle of, where is it that our energy is going to be focused towards and making sure that we're doing those things well rather than spreading ourselves too thin.
One of the things I find that happens for me in that is that a lot of my ministry is based on critical mass. Is there enough people interested in this and then paying attention? And so we've just started a free community meals that we do once a month with 4 other churches. And we were talking about that for 5 years, and then all of a sudden everything just came together. And it just said, okay, let's respond to that. And the community was on board. So there's a lot of having to just wait for that critical mass for that ministry to bubble forward rather than say, oh, I learned about a program at this last conference, and if we just do it this way, then our children are going to grow.
Well, and the other thing is that sometimes our churches are small because they're new and they're growing, and sometimes our churches are small because they're older and aging and they're in a different season. And if you have a church, I go to a lot of our small churches, and they'll actually have more elected positions than members in their church. And so they're desperately trying to fill all these roles, and they actually don't physically have enough human beings to do it. Or as you said, some of the people really feel like they've put their time in. Or a small church, especially in a rural area, is impacted by being rural. So the town itself might be aging. And the reality is of kind of that pool to draw from becomes unique. So all those things are so interesting.
One of the side effects that emerges from having somebody filling so many positions, you'll have people in the church that are filling 12 positions, is that they're maintaining 12 positions, and they don't really have time to create, develop, dream about a particular ministry.
So is there something and I'd love to hear Ron's thoughts on this too, because I think that can trip up small churches because they have structures that no longer fit the size of their church. Have you ever had to deal with that, or what have you done? You want to start, Ron? We'll come to these folks. What do we do when our structure just doesn't actually fit the size of our church anymore? I was actually at an event one time, and the woman said, I'm taking on the moderator role and the clerk role, and there's no one else to do it. I said, how many are in your church? She said 8. And I said, does your church really need a moderator with 8 people? But they were having a hard time seeing past it. Yeah. Wait, what do you think?
I think that's absolutely crucial for small churches, is to appreciate who they are and design their focus, their ministry around that. God doesn't intend a church of 20 to do what that church down the road of 400 can do. And so often, one of the life-changing things that I read one time, it was from a book by Dr. Henry Cloud called Integrity. And he said reality is always your friend.
Ooh, I like that.
And there's a lot of small churches that need to learn that.
Oh, that is, let's say that again.
Reality is always your friend.
Yeah. And you're right. Sometimes as small churches, we're looking up the road and saying, oh, I saw they did this. Sounds like what you've learned, Ruth. But is that something we can do? You both were not a lot when I said, how do we revisit these structures? Thoughts?
Yeah, well, it's literally right now with our church, we just within the last week had one of our key volunteers step down because of burnout and just stuff that's going on in their own life. And so we're left with that question around the structures of like, is this structure actually working for us? What do we need to change? What do we need to change immediately? What do we need to change in the future? Because again, you were talking about how, our older congregations, I keep hearing these echoes of what once was, or I go through the archives and I see pictures and, hear about like the thunderous like stomps of 100 kids running upstairs for Sunday school, where now we're renting that space to a daycare school in order to kind of balance the budget kind of thing. So yeah, the idea of figuring out our structure, figuring out what works is huge. And one of the things that I've kind of made my mission since ending up at Calvary is just to be constantly asking the question, what is God calling you into in this season? And what's he calling you to let go of? And to be constantly asking the volunteers that position for us to figure out, first and foremost, what is it that God's actually calling us to, so that we're not just doing a bunch of roles just to do a bunch of roles because they need filling, but then stepping back and saying, no, wait, I'm actually really more gifted in this. And like, I've seen this in a lady who was our moderator a few years ago, and she was just like, I'm done. I need to step back. So she took the step back. And then we found that our pastoral care needed a little bit more attention. And so she stepped into that role, and she's been thriving in that, just coordinating visits, making sure people are phoned, actually driving people to make those visits happen, especially me since I'm a TTC girl. So it's helpful to have a whole bunch of ladies in the church with cars. But she's able to thrive more and minister really effectively because she stepped back in to what it was that she really felt that God was calling her to do.
I think COVID helped a lot during this time. And I think other pastors would see likewise, where everything shut down. And so we took the approach that we wouldn't start anything up until we felt we needed it. And so there are a lot of ministries that have not started up again. And nobody has missed them. And within the structures, it's been a mixed blessing. So we had a number of deacons, and the reason we had all these deacons is because that's how much you needed to do communion. And so, suggesting that maybe we could bring in people that aren't deacons to assist in serving communion allowed us to maybe direct. So and the aim was to try to get people to have to do less jobs. But what's also interesting is people attach a lot of sense of belonging and status to the titles they had. And some positions we made non-elected positions so that they could be just, and it didn't quite, it was harder to find somebody for an unelected position than an elected position because there was a sense of participation and ownership in that ministry. So that's a lesson that's been learned from me in this particular congregation is I felt that we could strip down the structure and be far more effective, but there are repercussions for taking away titles and removing that. And there's a pastoral care element that has to happen in a small church to transition from there.
That goes back to what you said about that you have to look at each congregation uniquely. And same thing, there's no one size fits all. Yeah. So asking those hard questions, but all of you talked about loss. How do we, so I think sometimes the small churches, if they've pared down to being small, how do we help our churches process the grief and loss that comes with that and the changes of the things they're letting go?
I've had two churches that were in that situation. I started my ministry in a 2-point charge at Malmesbury and Westover, and where I am now. And in both cases, the messaging has been the same. We might die, but how do we do ministry? So one church was our motto was minister till we die. And we just said, isn't
that all our mottos?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or at least it should be.
Yeah.
And
until God says, well done.
Takes away that anxiety that comes with feeling we have to somehow succeed at something. Yeah. We just need to do good ministry. And I think for our congregation in Aylmer, Ontario has been, I can't tell you what the future. I know that Christ's church will survive.
Yeah.
I don't know if this congregation will, but this is where God has placed us.
So focus on, what has God called us to now? Which is interesting because I'm hearing you say it means that we're not just looking to the past to try to recreate it, but we're also not fixated on like just some nefarious future that we may or may not come, right? And it might not be nefarious. It might be very hopeful. So I think small churches, when they're struggling, can get stuck in that. They can get stuck on, we need to look like we once did, or we need to find a new version of that thing so that we can be big again. Like, how do we help small churches see past the goal of getting bigger, see past that as the only mark of success? Ron is, I'm seeing his eyes twinkling.
I think that for 50 or 60 years, we have been told that the sign of success in a church is numerical numbers. So the more pews you fill, more successful you are. And I think churches desperately need to understand that their value doesn't come from their size. Their value comes from their relationship with Jesus Christ. And Jesus says that he loves the church. And that's not just the churches over 2,500 people that he loves. He loves those churches of 25. I have something that I never let someone get away with saying, and that is, we're just a small church. I'll correct them and say, you're not just a small church. You're a part of the body of Christ.
This desire for success, I think, also came in the form of believing the success was to abandon the 3-point charge and the 2-point charge and become an independent one pastor charge. And I don't know whether that was a good thing. I mean, the large church moved to, multi-site churches. And we've a kind of, in the rural community, not found a way of positively embracing 2 churches with a pastor and a half working together in a shared ministry. And I think there's some work for us to look towards in terms of saying, can we reestablish a positive view of a 2-point charge, or that allows us to be effective in ministry while maintaining the sense of identity?
Now, here's a bit of a different question. I guess we could almost do this playing bingo sometimes. We've joked about small church pastors can end up doing a whole mix of everything. What are some of the tasks that you end up doing as a pastor of a small church that probably wouldn't happen in a bigger church? I will give an example from mine, which was that I always cleaned out the fridge in the kitchen. And a couple months after I left the church where I was pastoring, someone mentioned something to me about the fridge. And I was like, oh, right, because now there's no one cleaning the fridge, making sure that the food gets thrown away. So, I've done my time cleaning up the coffee cups on the Sunday morning, or, doing the drives to get the extra cookies for the church dinner. What are some examples of things you end up doing, either small or big, that you think larger churches, maybe they wouldn't have that on their plate?
I mean, I just immediately think of all of my friends I went to Wycliffe for my master's, so I'm a lot of friends with a lot of Anglican priests. And when they go through their ordination service, there's this line that says, to perform the other ministrations entrusted to you. And we always giggle whenever we get to that line, because so much of ministry is the stuff that's outside of what you actually have on your job description, and the actual, like, the preaching.
Other ministrations
as a side. And so, some of the other ministrations that I've put a lot of energy into over the past couple of years is getting rid of our junk for Jesus around the church, and doing some deep cleans with one of our key volunteers of just kind of pulling out stuff so that we can free up space for other things. So I think that's the one that comes to the top of my mind.
Ron or Michelle, anyone that you found yourself doing?
I think there's an expectation to be there for everything.
Yeah.
Anytime you're not there, it's noticed. That you weren't at the women's luncheon, or you weren't at this thing. And it doesn't mean that you have to continue that, but you have to navigate that of saying, I won't be able to attend because I won't be able to attend the kitchen committee meeting, because even though I don't think that expectation would have been there in a larger church, it would assume that belongs to some other committee.
Anything you'd add, Ron?
Just maybe to give a little bit of context. One of the things that we've done in the last number of years was we partnered with the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada to do a research project on small churches, and it's called Significant Church. And one of the things that they said was that small church pastors are known as generalists. There's not a small church pastor out there that gets 35 hours a week to do a sermon. There's just too many other things to do. But they said, the small church pastor is the only expert that we have in this country on small churches.
You just keep making the three of us over here. We're just all over the place, Ron.
and so it's true that there's things that you would do that most pastors wouldn't. But you also bring a level of expertise in that to the church in Canada that we can't get anywhere else.
That's so beautifully said. And I think sometimes we kind of can laugh about that. I remember on a Sunday going to speak at a really large mega church. I took a Sunday off and I went and spoke at this church that would have had 3 or 4 on a Sunday. And I was in the green room and they were like, "Oh, do you need anything?" Whatever. I said, "This is heaven." I said, "Normally this would be," and when I'm again walking through the church and cleaning up any extra garbage, and the night I would have been tidying up my PowerPoint, and they said, "You do your own PowerPoint," and it was hilarious. And I just laughed. I was like, "Yeah, I do my own PowerPoint. That's hilarious." So it's just. But when you say, "But I didn't see that as a bad thing," it just was. But so there's all these challenges. But like you say, we're these experts. So we talked about the challenges. What are the joys and blessings of serving in a small church? What are the things that make this such a special ministry?
Knowing and being known. I think that's the biggest thing for me, to know that when somebody new walks into the church is going to notice. And we've, worked our way through of how to invite people into the church without immediately asking them to do stuff. We've been able to work through that. But it's that sense of being known. And it was interesting. I sat down with one of our newer attendees at church, and I was just like, tell me about your experience so far at Calvary. Like, what are some of the things that, are good, and some of the things that are hard? And she's like, well, it's kind of the same thing. It's small, and that's a really wonderful thing because you get to know people and that kind of stuff. But it's like, it's too bad more people don't get to know this and experience this. And it was one of those things where I really felt that whole small is mighty, and the power of the small church, of recognizing that we have this really unique opportunity to make sure that everybody who walks in feels known and can find that sense of belonging. I think a lot more quickly and a lot more organically in small churches, where I know the big churches, you really have to work at it and to be able to even distinguish that there is a new person. I was attending a non-CBOQ church before I got called into the ministry, and they were geared towards young working professionals. And one of the difficulties with that is that you constantly had people that were away for business trips. So you didn't actually know how long someone had been away. So someone could have been sick, or something drastic could have been going on, but you would have thought that they were just away for a weekend. But having this small church context at Calvary, it's just so precious to be able to notice when someone's not showing up, to notice when someone new shows up, and to have everybody kind of have their eyes peeled to, okay, how is it that I'm going to be able to greet the rest of my church family today? And I remember just a few Sundays ago, just kind of looking around and feeling so pleased as punch that I was the only person that wasn't talking to somebody, and that everybody else had someone that they were engaging with after church. And that just made me really grateful for watching and seeing the growth within the congregation, to be able to really notice and be intentional about connecting with one another. Knowing and being known.
Knowing and being known.
Yeah,
what other strengths and joys?
I think I totally agree with that. I think when I was serving as a pastor in a small church, one of the things that I loved was the fact that I got to share in the important family moments of the people that I was pastoring. And so when I performed a wedding, it was almost like I was doing it for my daughter or my son. And that was true of so many things, that I just was a part of of the life of these people that I was serving.
Yeah, I find you get a lot of time to spend with people in different life situations. And for me, it's a reminder of how vastly differently gifted we are. And I've got, I think, if she's listening, I'm going to be in trouble, but I think she's 92. And yet she will talk on the phone 6 hours a day to 12, 13 different people just to check in on them, to see how they're doing. I could never do that. And there are giftedness there that I just don't have. And I think being in a small church has reminded me I don't have to. I have to bring my gifts and they bring theirs. I think sometimes in larger churches, we lose sight of that because we're into job descriptions and we have different tasks to perform. So that's a big joy for me.
And so the small church has taught you something too, which is fabulous. So if there's someone listening and they're a minister, pastor, and they're about to step into a small congregation for the first time or again, what do you think they should know? What would you say? Here's some tips I'd have for you as you step into ministry in a small church.
I think every seminary and Bible college in Canada should teach a course on Patience 101.
I think that might come in handy in every size church. Yeah.
Yes.
And that's what I would say to them. You need to be patient. You need to. One of the things that came out of this study that just really caught my attention, this significant church, was that they talked about church covenants and saying that every church has that. And that's just simply how that church functions. Usually unwritten. Just everybody,
the unwritten small church covenant.
Everybody just knows what it is. And I would say to that new pastor, you can't hope to effectively minister here until you know and understand that covenant.
So they need to know the church. They need to know the people. They need to know the unwritten rules. Yeah. So if they're starting, take your time.
Take your time.
Take your time. And all those conversations, that ministry that you're doing is setting yourself up for future ministry and laying that groundwork, right? What would you all add about what they should know?
I would add, learn the 3 steps forward, 2 steps back. We have to learn how to recognize when we're wrong or when our thoughts probably weren't as great as we thought they were, and being able to walk that back and allow that trust to be reestablished, because we're going to do that. As in small churches, everybody knows everybody really well, and you're going to mess up, and you need to be able to step back and say, I'm pushed, and now I got to step back and we start again. And so I would say, don't come expecting that it's your way or the highway. Be willing to step back and start fresh again.
Do you want to add anything, Ruth?
I was just feeling that very, very deeply, like how I've learned that experientially. I guess my thoughts were more so just like general attitudes rather than particular tips and tricks. Yeah, sure. And I had a handful of them. But your role is just as precious, even if the numbers are smaller. And again, this is something that I have had to work through myself, to put the green-eyed monster aside when I look at, so much of my family, but like my brother and my sister-in-law, who are both in ministry at a multi-site, multi-staff situation. And just to be constantly recognizing that there is still like a purpose that God has for me here in this small church. And so that's what I would encourage those new pastors to recognize, that even if the numbers look different, like the importance is that your role is just as precious. And in the same vein, your kingdom impact always has been and always will be important to God. And he's the one who's going to decide where he's going to place you. So be faithful to the who and where that he's called you to. And for the fact that you've been called to that place for such a time as this. And I have not felt that like so deeply in my life than the time that I've been ministering at Calvary, to realize that the particular skill set that I have, the particular way of being that I am, was what Calvary has and does need at this point in time. But just to be faithful with where God's called you for this season, to be faithful to that season, and to, both hang in there for as long as God has you there, and also know when it's time to step away, then to step away gracefully, even if things feel unfinished. Just don't fall into the comparison trap. That's the biggest thing. When we meet with other pastors, I'm so encouraged, but it can also get so discouraging simultaneously, almost sometimes in the same moment of just, we have to recognize that God has placed us where we are for a reason. And he has brought you to that small church to use the gifts that you have and to equip the saints to use their gifts and to see what God does with that offering, even if it doesn't look as big as it used to, or it could look down the street, but to see what it is and how it is that God has uniquely gifted you to serve this church in this season.
So how can other churches and your CBOQ family support our small churches better? So those listening that are from the small churches, I think that would so resonate with every word you all said. And thank you for that encouragement, Ruth. What about those listening going, yeah, I've never really thought about this before. What would you like to say to those people that you're joining with in the ministerials and in the association and assembly meetings that would be helpful?
I would say talk to Tanya.
Talk to Tanya. Say more.
I think that her work with intergenerational ministry, her ability to communicate not only with pastors, with laity, has made her...
So Tanya Yoon, our one of our staff people, Children and Family Ministries Associate.
I think she's got a good model, and it's been very well received from our congregation. And I think there's that type of teaching that walks alongside of lay leaders and invites pastors to tag along.
Yeah.
But pastors, we can get our training in a lot of places.
Yeah.
Our lay leaders really...
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for that awesome plug. What else? What would you want people to know about how to better include small churches, or you as a small church pastor?
Yeah, I think the big thing for me is just recognize that we can't be all things to all people, and that we recognize the sacrifices that we're giving up. So when encouraging us to do all that we can for the kingdom, recognize that we still only have so many human resources to work with, and we have to be so careful that we're not burning out our leaders and our volunteers. So as much as and encouraging it might be that like, oh, well, if you try this new thing and you get this thing going, it's just like, great. Can you find us 20 people to do that? Because our core volunteers are already tired. So I know that at Calvary, like we've done a really good job of really fine tuning what it is that we're called to in this season. And it's not to say that that's what we're called to do specifically for the rest of all time, but we've pared it down to worship, discipleship, care for seniors, and our food bank. And those are the things that where our drive of our energy is going to go. And if God raises up the right people in order to make something else kind of birth out, great. But just, I think just the one thing that I just want to hear from, the rest of the CBOQ family is just encouragement in the things that we are focusing on, and just to kind of keep at bay some of those voices of trying to be like, well, what if you tried this, and trying to do more. So just recognize that like we're at capacity and we're doing as best that we can. So I think that's really what I would love to hear more.
Thank you. How about you finish this off for us, Erlen?
I would say, I think we need to give small churches a voice. At every level of the CBOQ, I think, we need to be sure, and I'm not sure what the breakdown would be, but we need to make sure that a significant amount of the board consists of small church pastors. We need to make sure that the staff here includes people who primarily have ministered in small churches. We need assembly. I would love to see an assembly that there's workshops and I'd love to see some year a keynote speaker from a small church. That small churches feel like they're being heard. And it's not enough just that they're being heard, but that it's making a difference in how things happen. And one of my dreams is that the day will come when nothing of significance will happen in the church in Canada without there being a small church voice at the planning stage. So that, we still include organizations like the Evangelical Fellowship, obviously, and the Four Cs and all these different ones, but that there's that small church voice. Because only a small church person can bring that voice.
Mm-hmm. Well, Ron, can you do a plug for us as we end? We've got lots of that's so insightful, and we've got lots of small church pastors listening here, and they might be saying, tell me more about the small church network. What can that do for a small church pastor, a small church?
There's a number of things that we're doing. We, at the very heart of what we want to do is just encourage small church people. As I say, I think they carry, they have such an important role in the evangelical church in Canada. So the two of you are way more important than either one of you probably give yourself credit for. I love just sitting down one-on-one with pastors and other people from small churches. And I spoke at a small church in Toronto a while back, and I said to them before I spoke, I said, I think I need to tell you that if, I've had this scheduled for a little while, and if the pastor at People's Church had come to me last week and said, Ron, we're desperate, we need someone to fill in next Sunday, will you speak? I said, I would pause for about 3 seconds, and then I would say, I'm sorry, I've already got a church to speak at. And I could see it in their faces that meant something to those who were sitting there in the small church. And so that's a huge part. We sponsor retreats, and those are just, a few days where we bring pastors away from their normal routine. And I like to say for those days, we just spoil them rotten. The input that we've gotten there is from them when we've asked them to evaluate has been that it's been so nice to just be able to sit and talk with other small church pastors and across denominational lines. They've enjoyed that. And the other thing I'll maybe mention is that we're in the process, just sort of at the beginning of it, but we're in the process of trying to establish a small church network where small church pastors can interact with other small church pastors. And so really, I would encourage anyone listening to go into our website, smallchurchconnections.com, and you'll see a lot more about who we are and what we're trying to do.
Well, thank you for that ministry.
Can I say one last thing about that? And that's that I like to say to churches that when I speak at them that if I visited your church and right where it is right now, and I spoke there, let's say on a Sunday morning, and then I came back in about 3 years' time, and God had done this amazing thing, and you were 10 times larger than you are, and your budget was in the millions, and you're running all kinds of programs and everything else, you would not be one speck more value in God's eyes than you are right now.
Yes, Ron. Yes.
And I think that's something that small churches really need to understand.
I just can't think of a better way, the better last word. But I do want to take a moment to say thank you to all our small churches, and thank you to all our small church pastors and leaders, to say that we care about you, we love you, we're here to support you, and we're glad you're part of our family of churches in CBOQ. And you do indeed matter to us, and you will not matter any more or less based on if you get smaller or bigger. Thank you.
Could I say one last thing?
Yes.
Yeah. And that's one of the things that I've really, as part of the CBOQ, one of the things that I really have been excited about over the last few years, as I've chatted with you and I've chatted with Ken and I've chatted with others, is that I really do believe you really do care for the small churches in this denomination.
We do. We do. I'm glad
Yeah.
you see that. We know it can be hard to sometimes feel that when you're in a smaller church. But if you haven't felt that, I hope you'll reach out to CBOQ and we can help rectify it, I hope. Michelle, Ruth, Ron, thank you. Thank you for being here today. But thank you for your ministry in your small and mighty churches. God bless you.